goes on. From the point of view of studying, therefore, what I would suggest is that you concentrate your studying on the material that we covered since the midterm, but make sure you do a sort of a review of the previous term so that you're not completely, so you haven't completely forgotten about all that stuff. You got a question? I believe the last test was an hour, is that correct? And the value of that is also the same. Check the syllabus, and syllabus will have exactly details, so I'm pretty sure that that's the case. Okay, before I get into any other new material, let me quickly see if there's any quick questions or comments about anything else related to the class. Yes, up in the back. The final test is an hour, just as the midterm was. That's it? Okay. In that case, let me try to pick up where we left off last class. Before I do so, however, I just want to say a couple of things about current events that are certainly relevant to the class. And most of us that are interested in international politics have been very closely watching what's been going on in the Ukraine. That seems to be the most worrisome part of the globe at the moment. Not that there aren't other places that are also problematic. But this morning, the New York Times reported that apparently the Russian government is amassing troops on the eastern border of the Ukraine for possible intervention. The Russians, of course, are saying this is nothing unusual, they're just practices and so on and so forth. But Angela Merkel, in response to that, has issued some rather strong words saying that they will not tolerate interference in the Ukraine and that this will result in much more strict sanctions and so on. I can't enlighten you much more about what's going on the ground in the Ukraine. However, one good way of thinking about this is one that we started to discuss last class. When we were talking about international conflict, the possibilities of war, and so on. And one of the things that we talked about a little bit in that context is a concept that we call bargaining range. Bargaining range. And what we meant by bargaining range is that when there is a conflict between two states, there are always the ideal outcomes of that conflict from one point of view, the ideal outcomes from the opposite point of view. And insofar as there is no room, no overlap between them, conflict is fairly likely. Conflict can be avoided insofar as there's a bargaining range. In other words, a range of outcomes that both sides would be satisfied with. And it would be interesting from that point of view to think about the situation in the Ukraine through that notion of bargaining range. And in this case, of course, there are a number of different players, and we could apply to a number of different players, but it might be most useful from an international relations perspective to think of the dominant players as Russia and the West, or Russia and the United States. And to try to think of, are there outcomes that would be acceptable both to the United States and to the Russian government in this current conflict. And while I don't want to exhaustively analyze the various proposals on the table, the unfortunate conclusion that I would come to, at least superficially, is that there's not really much of a bargaining range. That there is not really any position in the middle between these two that both sides will be satisfied with. In essence, a reabsorption of any part of the Ukraine by Russia would be unacceptable to the West, or at least that's what the West has so far indicated, and what the United States has certainly indicated. And on the other side, a hostile government in the Ukraine, and a Ukrainian government that's a member of NATO would be utterly unacceptable to the Russian side. And that leaves very little in the way of bargaining room. And that is a worrisome prospect. And given that the United States has increased its military exercises in Poland, in the Baltic republics, in a number of places in Eastern Europe, and that the Russian government is also flexing its military muscle in the region, we should be very, very worried about all of this. A possible outcome that might satisfy both sides could be a Ukraine independent and perhaps hostile to the Russian government, with much of the Russian population protected by the Russian government in particular in the Crimea region. The Crimea region is over 70% Russian speaking, and this is obviously the outcome that Mr. Putin is currently promoting in launching a plebiscite within, or referendum if you prefer, within the Crimea as to its future. On that score, there are a couple of different outcomes that could result. One is, it's fairly clear that the West does not seem keen on such a plebiscite or referendum, and in particular doesn't seem that doesn't accept that a referendum can take place in the current context with Russian troops on the ground and so on. They would argue that any outcome of such a referendum would be meaningless and that people would be subject to coercion given the presence of Russian forces and so on. You have to take all of that with a little bit of a grain of salt. Of course, the West has been talking extensively about the Russians having invaded the Crimea and having stationed 16,000 troops there. The Russian government is actually under a treaty with the Ukrainian government entitled to maintain 25,000 troops in the Ukraine. And the 16,000 that are currently there, according to the Russian government, and there's some credibility to that, were always there all along. They were in their military bases that were in the Crimea and have simply taken up other positions within the Crimea, but they weren't introduced from Russia. I can't say whether that's true or not. I'm not on the ground, but in any event, the West would probably not accept that. If this referendum takes place, and I believe it's supposed to take place on the 20th of this month, and the outcome very likely is that the Crimea will choose to separate from the Ukraine. The second possible set of outcomes is that the Crimea becomes an independent state, somewhat like South Ossetia and Abkhazia that are seceded from Georgia, under the protection or an alliance with the Russian government, but not properly part of Russia. And there's some indication that this might be slightly more acceptable to the West than an outright annexation of Crimea by the Russian government. And it might be a position that is also acceptable to the Russian government. If the Crimea is an independent state dominated by Russian population, then Russia could maintain its Baltic fleet in Sevastopol, its naval base there, and perhaps everyone would be satisfied. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to be the case, and so far the West is strongly indicating that they would not be satisfied with that. But they would certainly prefer that to an outright annexation of the Crimea by Russia. The problem with both of these outcomes, however, is that it raises further problems. It raises further problems in that arguably, if the Crimea is withdrawn from Ukrainian territory, it will make Russian-speaking populations in the remainder of eastern Ukraine all the more vulnerable to a much more powerful Ukrainian-dominated government, and therefore might have the result that it increases the likelihood of Russian intervention to protect its Russian minorities within the Ukraine. And that, again, could raise further problems and almost certainly would result in some kind of conflict, given the inclination of the current government to fight tooth and nail against any kind of an incursion by Russia. Again, we'll have to see how this all plays out, and perhaps some kind of a bargaining range that is acceptable to both sides will eventually emerge, although at the moment it doesn't, to me at least, look particularly encouraging. Anyway, any comments or questions regarding any of that? Yeah?
I read somewhere that the Ukrainian Constitution, when discussing a referendum or a plebiscite, it requires all of Ukraine to vote. So would a referendum in Crimea be illegal to the rest of Ukraine?
This is one of the claims made by the Ukrainian government itself and by the West. And for the most part, I'm not an expert on the Ukrainian Constitution. But the first question that arises is which Ukrainian Constitution? That of 2004, that of 2010, or the one that was just imposed a couple of weeks ago? And I'm not sure that there is consistency between those. And I mean, one of the problems, we're going to be talking about international law in a little bit in a few minutes, and the question that arises with regard to that is, what in the international realm, let alone in the Ukraine, would be required for the secession of a portion of the country from a sovereign state to be legitimate? And where has this happened before? It's happened before, it's happened extensively before. It, of course, happened in the disintegration of the Soviet Union, in which not the entire Soviet Union voted to allow each of the regions to withdraw from the Soviet Union. It happened in Yugoslavia. And likewise, in Yugoslavia, the Yugoslavian government did not approve the secession of Croatia or of Slovenia or later on of Kosovo and so on and so forth. And in each of these cases, the West didn't seem to have any problem with accepting those departures. In other words, international law as well as constitutions are kind of unclear. And to stick with the requirement that this is not in accordance to the Constitution is a little bit rich, coming from a government that just overthrew a government that was elected legitimately under a legitimate constitution. So I'm not sure that gets us very far, regardless of what the Constitution actually says. In terms of international law on that issue, when the West was backing the secession of Kosovo from Serbia back in 1998, and did so in part by bombing Serbia, the main governments behind that were the United States and Great Britain with their NATO partners. And when the U.S. first suggested this course of action, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain raised objections, saying that, and we can discuss that in a little while, but we might as well talk about it now, saying essentially, I think our lawyers have trouble with this. Anyone know what Madeleine Albright, the then Secretary of State, responded to that? Well, get different lawyers. In other words, there is a great deal of scope for interpretation in international law. It is, to use one of the terms used over here, not all that precise in terms of exactly what the restrictions of international law are. And that means that there's a great deal of room to maneuver and to massage things that might, on the face of things, seem fairly clear. A far better example of that kind of ambiguity, and again, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, so I might as well jump ahead on that. Is one aspect of international law that would seem on the surface to be fairly cut and dry. And that is the International Convention Against Torture. This was passed by the United Nations and all members of the United Nations, including all members of the Security Council, and it was ratified in all relevant governments, and for that reason is international law. And it's pretty cut and dry. Torture is illegitimate under any circumstances, no matter what the emergency and so on. It is contrary to international law. When George W. Bush decided that the gloves had to come off after September 11th, he essentially got together with a bunch of lawyers and said, what can we do? How far can we go? And they sat down and looked at, well, how do we define torture? And ultimately, John Yoo and David Addington, the top lawyers in President Bush's Office of Legal Counsel, came up with the definition that torture, or the definition, or the term torture, only applies to methods that impose pain equivalent to organ failure or near death. Anything else is legitimate. And thus, waterboarding was legitimate. Thus, putting people into stress positions for extended periods of time was legitimate. Subjecting people to extreme levels of cold for extended periods of time was legitimate. Subjecting people to extreme levels of heat for extended times was legitimate. Depriving people of sleep for more than a week at a time was considered legitimate. All of these were simply enhanced interrogation techniques, but not torture. And George Bush is perfectly legitimate in saying that, look, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer. I asked my lawyers, and my lawyers said that that was okay. And therefore, we went ahead with that. How the heck would I know if my lawyers are wrong? And of course, John Yoo, who might have been dragged in front of a criminal court of some sort for offering this advice, is instead teaching at Stanford Law School after he left the Bush administration. In other words, nothing has ever been done about this. And again, it illustrates the extent to which there is considerable wiggle room in international law when the lawyers get to work on it. Just as there is, as most of you are aware, in domestic law. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay, let me return to international law. I want to get through this fairly quickly because we, as you are, I'm sure, aware, have fallen fairly far behind our schedule. And I do want to get caught up, but we will be caught up, I think, by our last class because our next two classes are somewhat more in the nature of summaries than specific topics. So we will cover all the materials relevant by the time that the final test takes place. Last class I pointed out that there are a number of different components of international law, such as constitutive law that defines some things such as sovereignty, non-intervention, and self-determination. What's often referred to as fundamental or procedural law that defines the basic norms of coexistence of states, such as diplomacy, and regulative law that spells out how states should act in regard to being confronted with human rights violations, thus the responsibility to protect under R2P, the nuclear taboo, territorial integrity as the norm, and so on and so forth. There are also a number of issue-specific regimes. And I mentioned one such issue-specific regime being the Torture Convention. But there are also others, such as the banning of chemical weapons that most of us are aware of due to the situation in Syria. The convention, or the issue-specific regime with regard to preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and treaties to ban certain types of weapons, such as landmines, use of cluster munitions, white phosphorus, and so on and so forth. I don't want to reiterate all of that. Suffice it to say that the origin of most of these were various kinds of treaties. But before I get into that, let me also very quickly mention the issue of consistency. International law is not entirely consistent. It has aspects that are contradictory, and as I just talked about, some aspects that are rather unclear. And a very good example of that regard is, once again, very much related to the topic we were just discussing. The basic norm since the since the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson first proposed that the right to national self-determination be enshrined in international law, versus the issue of sovereignty. Now, a sovereign state is sovereign, is in that guaranteed non-interference in its internal affairs by outside forces. But how does that relate to the national self-determination of the citizens of that state? Is the promotion of separatism in a country like the Crimea a violation of international law that guarantees sovereignty to Ukraine? Or is it merely upholding the law in the sense of promoting the right of national self-determination? On that question, essentially, international law is unclear. And thus we end up in situations like that in Kosovo and in Ukraine. The sources of treaties, or the sources of international law, overwhelmingly are treaties. Beginning with the Treaty of Westphalia, that we talked about fairly extensively, that specifies the rights of monarchs, followed by the Treaty of Utrecht, that created the precedent for territorial sovereignty and recognition of borders and such. The Paris Treaty of 1814, which was the basis for the creation of the Concert of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles, which gave rise to the League of Nations and the various mandates associated with it. And in today's context, the most important are the UN Charter, and in 1960, the Declaration of Independence of her colonies. The UN Charter essentially makes up the core of international law today. Beyond that's kind of formally codified in the law, are things like international norms. And their origin is not necessarily in an actual treaty, but rather their source is the general observance of a particular norm by all members of the international community. The best example of such a norm is the general consensus within the international community that it is illegitimate to use nuclear weapons, and certainly illegitimate to use nuclear weapons as a first strike weapon. That's nowhere spelled out in international law, but it has been maintained and observed by all members of the international community since 1945. Nuclear weapons have never been used since Nagasaki and Hiroshima, at least not nuclear bombs, although certain nuclear types of munitions, such as depleted uranium shells, have been used fairly extensively, and they also raise problematic issues. And apparently they were used fairly extensively in the region around Fallujah during the Iraq War, and in the region around Fallujah there are now enormous cancer rates that can be explained by little else other than the use of these kinds of munitions. The problem with international law, however, is that the supreme international law of all is the late law of sovereignty, of state sovereignty. And that, to some extent, makes every other aspect of international law problematic. To what extent can such international laws be enforced without violating the sovereignty of states? And furthermore, who is to enforce them? Ideally, of course, it would be the United Nations as an international organization that would enforce such international law. But we talked a fair bit about the United Nations and its various problems. And chief among those problems is that the United Nations is itself an arena through which the international community, meaning states throughout the international community, act. And act primarily in their own self-interest. And that is, of course, in particular the case with regard to the Security Council, in which the most powerful states are represented and given veto power. And thus, the ability of the international community through the United Nations to enforce international law is highly problematic. Nonetheless, international law is slowly moving from international law to what might be called supranational law. Supranational law that can be imposed upon states, even if they are not, even if they don't consent to it. And that would fairly blatantly supersede the requirement of state sovereignty. The most important step taken in that direction, and one that was taken fairly with a fair bit of involvement of the Canadian government, was the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. That was adopted by the United Nations during the 1990s, to a large extent in response to the massacres, if not genocide, in Rwanda and in the former Yugoslavia. Such atrocities, it was argued, are intolerable. And the international community has a responsibility to intervene in these kinds of atrocities, to prevent these kinds of atrocities from happening, or to stop them insofar as they're already in progress. And sovereignty simply can't stand in the way of that. In other words, the United Nations can authorize members of the international community to violate state sovereignty in order to prevent humanitarian disasters. And one of the first examples of the exercise of the responsibility to protect was, anyone want to take a guess? One of the most prominent in any event was Libya. Is that what you were going to say? In Libya, as part of the Arab Spring in 2011, demonstrations broke out in a number of cities, in particular in Benghazi, against the government of Muammar Gaddafi. And the government of Gaddafi apparently came down pretty hard on these demonstrations, tried to suppress them, whereupon the protesters increasingly armed themselves, something that's not all that different from what we saw happening in Ukraine in the last few weeks, or from what we might be seeing happening slowly in Venezuela today. Indications were, according to the several European powers, and most notably also the United States, that the Gaddafi government was preparing to